Hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I am your host, Andy. And if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Also, today's episode is sponsored by myself. More specifically, I have a book about Bitcoin called Hyper-Bitcoinization, a story about a revolution. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there will be a link down below in the description for you to check it out. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon, and it should be the first result. It's not selling out if it's my own product. All right, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. So last week, we covered the basics of the inner workings behind Bitcoin. This week, we'll revisit the 6 properties of money and discuss how Bitcoin fits into the picture. Recall that the 6 properties of money describe certain characteristics that we want something to fulfill if it is to serve as money in society. In other words, things that perform well across these 6 properties tend to be good at serving as money. So don't worry if you don't remember what the 6 properties are. I will repeat them now. They are durability, portability, divisibility, homogeneity, scarcity, and acceptability. For example, as discussed in episode 3 when we covered the first 6 properties, we found that gold fares relatively well for durability, scarcity, and acceptability. However, it fares really poorly when it comes to portability, divisibility, and it fares okay at homogeneity. In contrast, fiat money as we know it today are almost the exact mirror opposite of gold, where fiat fares well in portability, divisibility, homogeneity, and in the case of the US dollar also fares extremely well in acceptability. However, fiat currencies fare extremely poorly in durability and scarcity. So at the end of episode 3, you as the viewer probably felt that you were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Or should I say, a gold bar and a dollar bill. Because it seems like both gold and fiat are bad in different properties, and we just have to choose the one that is the least bad. But what if there was an alternative? Let's now evaluate Bitcoin against the 6 properties. Recall the first property, durability, describes a money's ability to resist against degradation. Degradation is generally thought of as physical degradation. However, anything that can negatively affect a money's purchasing power over time is also considered to be degradation. For instance, fiat currency, although the money can be made to be water or decay resistant, it suffers from inflation, which degrades its purchasing power over time, which makes it not durable. So in other words, your dollar bill might be okay, but its purchasing power goes down. So who cares at the end of the day if it's a clean or crisp bill or a dirty bill? Bitcoin, as we know, is a digital asset, so already we can see how physical degradation does not really apply to it. Remember that the amount of Bitcoin that you have is simply a balance that is associated with an address that you control, which is on the blockchain. So even if you lose the private keys that control the address to your Bitcoin, the Bitcoin still exists. The balance is still there. Just like how if you were to lose your bank card, your money that is in your bank account doesn't just magically disappear by itself. But the difference between Bitcoin and a bank account is the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. As we discussed, every Bitcoin node always keeps a full copy of the Bitcoin blockchain, and these nodes are located all over the world. The easiest way to think about it is, imagine if you were working on a PhD thesis, and obviously you don't want to lose the file that you're working on because you spent the last few years of your life working on it. So what would you do to ensure that you didn't lose it? Well, you wouldn't just keep one copy of it on one computer, right? You'd buy a bunch of USB sticks, put a copy in each one, And also make sure you put a copy in Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, and maybe sign up for a few more file storage services just in case. This is a similar idea as to why your Bitcoin is secure. As of 2022, there are over 14,000 full Bitcoin nodes scattered all over the world in different continents, countries, jurisdictions. Because it's so decentralized, even if you manage to destroy or corrupt all the nodes in your area or even inside an entire country, it would not be enough to damage the network. So this is how Bitcoin is durable against physical attack. There's so many copies of the Bitcoin blockchain that there isn't a single point that one can attack that would hurt the entire blockchain. But also, Bitcoin is durable in a different way. Bitcoin is limited in number. The total number of Bitcoin that can ever exist is capped at 21 million. This means that, like gold, there's only so much of it out there, and once you've mined it all, it's gone. This is why you'll sometimes hear Bitcoin referred to as deflationary, because the amount of Bitcoin that is available can only go down in the long run as the amount is mined and becomes less and less as people misplace or lose their Bitcoin. And if they do, that removes their Bitcoin from their circulating supply forever. This is the opposite when it comes to our fiat money, which the government can print more of out of thin air at any time at their own discretion. The printing of money is why, since the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the US dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power. The government prints more money, so your money represents a smaller and smaller portion of the total amount of money that's out there, even though the number stays the same. So naturally, your money buys you less and less every year. If you own one Bitcoin, then you know that for certain, at no point in time ever, will your one Bitcoin represent a portion of the total Bitcoin money supply that is less than 1 out of 21 million. This is the way that Bitcoin resists against degradation of purchasing power caused by inflation. So as we can see, Bitcoin excels in both resistance against degradation of the physical kind and inflation of the money supply. Therefore, Bitcoin is incredibly durable. In fact, I would argue that it's even more durable than gold, since gold, being a physical object, is not immune to physical degradation. Even though it is relatively non-reactive against corrosion, it can still be damaged in other ways. For instance, you can accidentally chip off a piece of your gold bar or, drop it in a really intense acid that dissolved the gold. I don't know if that's possible, I'm not a chemist, but just as an example. I'm sure there's powerful enough acids out there that can destroy gold. Anyways, I digress. But that's a check mark for Bitcoin in durability. Moving on, the second property is portability. This one is easy to understand. It's the ability for money to be moved across space and time. You can see how, being a digital asset, Bitcoin once again has an advantage in this property. Bitcoin is borderless, and it does not require the approval of any third parties for a transaction to occur. If you lived in Japan and I lived in Canada, and I try to send you $100,000 in fiat currency, the bank might be on a holiday because it's a weekend, or the bank might not let me send it until I fill out a form, and even if I check all the boxes and I do everything right, the transfer will probably still take at least 2 to 3 business days. You can forget about trying to ship a giant bar of gold across an entire ocean. That would take much longer than 3 business days, and you most likely have to sell your kidney just to make sure that you pay the insurance of sending something that's that valuable. With Bitcoin, it takes 10 minutes or less for a transaction to be confirmed, and it doesn't care what country you're from or how physically far you are from me. There's actually ways for the transaction to be even instant. We'll talk about the Lightning Network and Layer 2s in another episode. So I think we can also check the box on Bitcoin for being extremely portable as well. So that's 2 for 2 for Bitcoin. Moving on, third, divisibility. The smallest subdivision of Bitcoin is called a Satoshi. It is named after the mysterious and pseudonymous founder of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto. I promise that we will dedicate an entire episode to covering Satoshi Nakamoto at a later time. But anyways, one Satoshi, or SAT for short, spelled S-A-T, is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, meaning that 100 million sats make up a Bitcoin. Currently, at the time of this writing, one sat is worth less than 1/50th of a cent in US cents, meaning that you need about 50 sats to make 1 cent. So with Bitcoin, you can get down to very granular levels. And I should note that as well is if Bitcoin's price rises so much one day that 1 sat becomes too big, then we can also just always subdivide it more. And it is trivially easy to make such a change. We're not even required to update any of the protocol itself. We're just going to change the way that something is represented. It's like if a nanometer is all of a sudden too large and we need a smaller length, it doesn't change anything in reality if we just change the way that we measure things. We can just subdivide it more. So yeah, Bitcoin is extremely subdividable, and it's actually infinitely subdividable. So it's 3 for 3 for Bitcoin. Moving on, the next property is homogeneity. Recall that this property describes whether or not a money is interchangeable with another unit of the same currency. So for instance, a dollar bill is worth the same as another dollar bill, even if one is clean and crisp and the other one looks kind of dirty. So for Bitcoin, Bitcoin also checks this box. There's no fundamental difference between Bitcoin sitting in one address versus Bitcoin sitting in another address. 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. Although I will note that in the past there have been threats to Bitcoin's homogeneity that could have disrupted this uniformity. So there have been efforts in the environmentally friendly investing special interest groups that have attempted to label Bitcoin as either having been mined with renewable energy or not. A Bitcoin that is mined with renewable energy was proposed to get a green seal, so to say. And my opinion of this is that this is dumb for a multitude of reasons. However, my biggest gripe that I have with this idea is that if we implemented this in reality, it will break the homogeneity for Bitcoin. People might view the Bitcoin with the green seal as being more valuable, and if that's the case, then 1 Bitcoin does not equal 1 Bitcoin, and we'd have a huge problem on our hands. You guys ever seen that episode of Rick and Morty where Rick changes the dollar value of like this alien civilization so that $1 does not equal $1 anymore, and then all hell breaks loose? Yeah, that's what's going to happen if you break homogeneity for Bitcoin, and that's what we want to avoid. And to be crystal clear, this is a problem because if $1 wasn't a dollar, and if $1 was sometimes $1.50 and a dollar was sometimes only 50 cents, that would be a huge problem, as you can tell. Luckily, though, these dumb ideas of the green seal Bitcoin were never implemented, and Bitcoin for now has been able to retain its homogeneity. So another check mark for Bitcoin. Next, we have scarcity. This, I think, is where Bitcoin really excels. So recall from earlier that I mentioned Bitcoin is limited to 21 million. Well, recently the world population just exceeded 8 billion people. So if you take 21 million and divide it by 8 billion, what do you get? Well, I'll let you work out the math, but it's a very small number. So on this note, though, I'd also like to add something. We know that fiat is not scarce at all since the government can just print it, but people also consider gold as scarce. So how does Bitcoin compare to gold in the scarcity category? As in, do gold and Bitcoin fare equally well in this category? The answer is no. Bitcoin fares better than gold. Why, you might be asking? Bitcoin is provably scarce, while gold is only scarce. What's the difference between provably scarce and scarce? Well, we know that the amount of gold on Earth is limited, but we don't exactly know how limited. Experts can make estimates, but there's no way that anyone can definitively say exactly how much gold there is on Earth. At any point, we might accidentally stumble upon a previously undiscovered gold deposit, and that would be a huge shock increase to the amount of gold available. In fact, this exact scenario happened as recently as July of 2022, where huge deposits of gold were found in Uganda, with some estimating the total amount to be worth in July 2022 prices for gold a whopping 13 trillion US dollars. Considering that the total market cap of gold is only $11 trillion, if the 13 trillion number is remotely real, And granted, it's doubtful, and some people have debated on whether or not that's actually the case. But even if it's remotely close to 13 trillion, this would be a huge disaster for anyone holding gold, since this would mean that the effective supply of gold would have more than doubled practically overnight. So this is not a problem for Bitcoin because the supply side of Bitcoin is completely known since it's algorithmically determined and written into the code, and the code cannot be changed without the approval of the network. The network has no incentive to change the code and remove the 21 million cap because that will hurt the entire Bitcoin ecosystem. So given that, we know exactly how much Bitcoin is produced per block. Right now, it's 6.25 Bitcoin per block, and the block reward is also cut in half roughly every 4 years. So as humans, especially when it comes to investing and economics, we like certainty. So with Bitcoin, you get a mathematical proof that it is scarce. That's why it's called provably scarce. But with gold, you can only guesstimate that it is scarce. If you're keeping track of the score at home, Bitcoin is 5 for 5. Next, moving on, lastly, we have acceptability. So this property describes a money's ability to be accepted as money in different locations with different people. I have to admit that this is an area where Bitcoin is actually not the best. The US dollar is undeniably the most widely accepted currency in the world, and currently Bitcoin still has a long way to go before it's able to challenge the US dollar in this regard. However, I will say that Bitcoin's acceptability is improving. With the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender in now 2 countries around the world, El Salvador and the Central African Republic, and smaller jurisdictions such as the town of Lugano in Switzerland, more and more people are using Bitcoin. I will now make a claim that Bitcoin is at least higher in acceptability than physical gold. Theoretically, most of the world still recognizes gold as money. But I think practically you'll have a hard time trying to get people to accept your gold if you're just out for a night on the town. The fact is that most merchants don't have equipment like the scales and the machines used to test for a gold coin's purity, so they won't be able to accept gold as payment. You're more likely to find a coffee shop that accepts Bitcoin than gold, in my opinion. But of course, again, I will admit defeat when I need to. Bitcoin is not the best in this category. But summarizing, Bitcoin still scored 5 out of 6 in the 6 properties of money. So overall, we see that Bitcoin is the best across these 6 properties overall, beating out fiat and gold. So with this in mind, I actually want to expand on the 6 properties a bit more. I know I said there were 6 properties, but I actually want to add 2 more properties that I think Bitcoin can bring to the table that fiat and gold cannot. So the first bonus category is non-sovereignness. So this property defines a form of money's independence from a centralized power and its ability to enforce its value. So in other words, does your form of money require a powerful ruler or a group of rulers to give it value? Or does it have value by itself? For instance, gold can be thought as non-sovereign as well. We demonstrated this fact about the Romans in episode 3, where I mentioned that the Germanic tribes who opposed the Roman Empire still accepted gold coins that bore the image of the Roman emperor who was their sworn enemy. This is because at the end of the day, gold is gold. And the gold is real. It doesn't require a Roman Empire to tell you that it's really valuable. Fiat currency is obviously the opposite of this. It is by definition sovereign. So the value of the US dollar depends on the continued existence of the US government. And with any fiat currency, that it depends on the government that issued it. It requires them to continue to exist and be powerful. But one point you might not have thought of is the question, is real estate sovereign or non-sovereign? So at first you're like, it's my house, I own it, and it has value by itself, so of course it's non-sovereign. But you'd be wrong. Real estate is actually sovereign because your ownership of the real estate is dependent on the enforcement by the government. If this wasn't the case and you were required to defend your own property, it's only a matter of time before you're overwhelmed, given enough external pressures, that you're going to get that real estate taken away from you. So for instance, let's say you were a Polish person who lived in Poland in 1939. Good luck explaining to your new German government how it's your land and you should be allowed to keep it. Because you cannot move real estate, the value of real estate to you is realized by your ownership of it, and the ownership is ultimately enforced by the state. So real estate is, in an indirect way, somewhat sovereign. Bitcoin is non-sovereign since its value is not controlled by any single entity, whether it be a person or a government, and your ownership of it is enforced by yourself, with you knowing the private keys to your Bitcoin. In fact, some people describe Bitcoin as self-sovereign, since you yourself fully control and fully own the Bitcoin. To explain this concept of ownership further, this segues neatly into our second bonus category, which is non-confiscatability. As it sounds like, it's the ability for an asset to resist being confiscated. And by confiscated, I mean taken away from you by force or by threat of force. This could be the government seizing your assets if they think you did something wrong, or it could just be someone robbing you. That counts as confiscation too. Ideally, I'm assuming that we don't want our assets to be confiscated away from us, so physical gold is confiscatable, right? So physical fiat currency is as well, cash. And obviously real estate is confiscatable as well. Anything that is physical is confiscatable. Fiat sitting in a bank account is also confiscatable because the bank can just freeze your account. So Bitcoin is what I like to call non-confiscatable, since you can secure it in such a way that makes getting to it practically impossible. We'll talk about Bitcoin storage in detail in a later episode, but for now, know that the most common way to store Bitcoin is through what's called a seed phrase. A seed phrase is a list of 12 or 24 English words from a special list. And they're just seemingly random English words. But when you set up your Bitcoin wallet, you'll generate a seed phrase, and whoever has that seed phrase can recreate the private keys of the Bitcoin just by typing in the seed phrase. So basically, the seed phrase is the wallet. And without the seed phrase, there's no way to access the Bitcoin. This is not recommended, but in theory, you could memorize your seed phrase to your Bitcoin wallet and destroy all the copies that you have of the seed phrase that are written down. Then, the Bitcoin literally only lives in your mind. Unless a hacker can hack your mind and steal the seed phrase, there's no way for anyone to access it now. Since the seed phrase is just a list of words, you can fit them on a piece of paper and take them across a border. Or let's say if you had $1 million in Bitcoin, that still all fits onto a piece of paper. In any case, if you hide your seed phrase very well and don't tell people where any of the copies are, then it's going to be extremely difficult for someone to confiscate your coins. So I'll let you think about that for a week. And I think this is a good point to end the episode on. So in summary, we talked about the 6 properties again, but for Bitcoin specifically. So let me end the episode here and leave you thinking about this for now. And next week, we'll talk about gold again and why gold just doesn't work. So thank you all for listening. I will see you guys next week. Thank you.